The moment Vanessa looked at my dress, her laughter echoed through the entire ballroom. $18, she said, her voice dripping with mock amusement. That dark blue dress is just so cheap. Did you pick it up at a garage sale? It was deeply embarrassing. A few people in her circle joined in on the laughter. I could feel every eye in the room scanning my creased navy dress, a dress I had stayed up all night hand-mending because it was the only decent thing I could afford. My son, Michael, stood right next to me, completely silent. My throat tightened. Clutching my purse, I turned toward the exit, desperate to hide the tears welling up in my eyes. But suddenly, the entire room fell dead silent. The CEO of Whitmore Capital himself, Charles Whitmore, was walking straight toward me. Without hesitation, he wrapped his arms around me in a warm, familiar hug. Before I go on with this story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been judged by the very people who are supposed to care about you, simply because of how you look, what you wear, or where you come from? If this story speaks to your heart, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is where you are. I love reading your stories and hearing your thoughts. I live in a small, single-story house in the west side of San Antonio, Texas. The paint around the windows is peeling, and the porch creaks every single time someone steps onto it. Most people driving by wouldn't even give a house like mine a second look. But to me, that little house is filled with 40 years of memories. Every morning, I still wake up at 5:30 out of habit, even though there is no one left to pack lunch for. I make my coffee in a chipped ceramic mug my husband, Thomas, bought me at a flea market 32 years ago. The words, "world's best mom," are nearly entirely faded now. Sometimes, when the house gets completely quiet around me, I run my thumb over those faded letters. As you get older, the silence becomes incredibly heavy, especially after you lose the person who used to fill the rooms with life. 9 years ago, Thomas passed away from heart failure. One moment he was sitting in his favorite chair watching baseball, and the next, my entire world fell apart in the back of an ambulance. After the funeral, people kept telling me the same thing. At least you still have Michael. And I did. My son was my pride and joy, my entire purpose, and the reason Thomas and I had worked ourselves to the bone for so many years. Thomas spent 30 years pouring concrete under the brutal Texas sun. By the time he was 50, his knees were shot, and his back never truly recovered from the construction accidents he chose to ignore just to earn overtime pay. As for me, I took whatever work I could find. I cleaned motel rooms, mended uniforms, altered wedding gowns, and sewed hems until my fingers literally bled. I used to sit at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning, the sewing machine clattering away while little Michael slept on the couch nearby just to be close to me. Sometimes, I would look at him sleeping with his math book pressed to his chest and whisper to myself, "He is going to have a better life." That dream was what kept me going during the years when we barely had enough money to put groceries in the fridge. There were so many nights Thomas and I pretended we had already eaten dinner just so Michael could have a second helping. We thought he never noticed, but children always notice. Michael was incredibly bright from the start. His teachers adored him. He won scholarships, earned awards, and unlocked opportunities we could only dream of when we were young. The day he got accepted into a top-tier business program, Thomas cried harder than I had ever seen him cry. Holding the acceptance letter with trembling hands, he kept saying, "Our boy made it." But success has a way of changing people slowly, not all at once. At first, Michael still called home every night. Then it became every weekend, and eventually, once every 2 weeks. Soon, our conversations were rushed and polite, as if he were talking to a distant relative instead of his mother. "I'm busy, Mom. I'll call you later. Work is crazy right now." Those words became a constant refrain. And then, Vanessa entered his life. The first time I met her, she was wearing a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She smiled politely, but there was a coldness in her eyes, as if she had already calculated my exact worth the second she saw my house. She hugged me carefully, as if poverty were something she could catch. During dinner, she asked a stream of questions that sounded friendly on the surface, but really weren't. "So, Michael grew up here. Did you really sew these curtains yourself? The neighborhood must have changed so much over the years." I knew what she was really asking. How did someone like you raise someone like him? But Michael looked happy, so I swallowed the discomfort. That is what mothers do. We swallow our pride so our children can keep smiling. Once they got married, things only got worse, and Michael didn't even seem to realize it. Vanessa hated when I visited unannounced. She hated my outdated clothes. She hated my Spanish accent when I spoke too quickly. Once, during a Thanksgiving dinner at their home in Dallas, I overheard her whispering to one of her friends in the kitchen. "Michael's mother is very sweet," she said softly, "but honestly, she is just a bit unrefined." They shared a quiet laugh. I pretended I hadn't heard a thing, because when you love someone, you learn to endure the small humiliations. Even so, no matter how distant Michael became, I never stopped being proud of him. Every month, I would have coffee with my friend Rosa at a little bakery downtown, and I would show her new pictures of Michael. Michael at a conference, Michael shaking hands with executives, Michael standing next to an expensive car. "He works so hard," I would tell her with a smile, meaning it with all my heart. Even if he barely called anymore, even if birthday wishes turned into quick text messages instead of visits, and even if I sometimes stared at a silent phone for hours, debating whether to call him. One rainy Thursday afternoon, I was mending a blue bridesmaid dress for a customer when I heard the mailbox clatter. I wiped my hands on my apron and walked slowly to the front door. Among the bills and grocery coupons was a thick, cream-colored envelope with elegant, handwritten script. The return address was New York. My heart instantly skipped a beat. I carried it carefully to the kitchen table before opening it. Inside was a short, handwritten note. "Dear Abigail, I hope you are doing well. I think of your kindness more often than you know. I may finally have an opportunity to return a small part of what I owe you. I hope to see you soon. C.W." I stared at those initials for a long time. Then, I folded the letter neatly and placed it in a wooden drawer next to a few others just like it. I had never told Michael about these letters. I had never told anyone. Some stories feel too sacred to explain, too important to place in careless hands. That evening, I was standing at the kitchen's sink washing dishes as the Texas sunset painted the room in warm orange hues. For the first time in months, my phone rang. It was Michael. Before I even answered, a smile found its way to my face. "Hi, sweetheart." There was a pause on the other end, then he cleared his throat. "Hey, Mom, there's a company gala next weekend. Vanessa and I were thinking maybe you could come." My heart beat so fast it actually hurt. For a second, I truly thought the phone call was just my imagination. After hanging up that night, I stood alone in the kitchen, pressing the phone to my chest with tears in my eyes. My son hadn't invited me to anything important in a very long time. Not out of obligation, not for a rushed holiday dinner, and not because someone else insisted. He wanted me there. At least, that is what I told myself. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I opened my closet and stared at the small row of dresses hanging inside. Most were old dresses I wore to church, or things I had worn to funerals and community events. None of them were suitable for a corporate gala filled with wealthy executives. Still, I touched each hanger gently. A mother never wants to embarrass her child, especially one she has sacrificed everything for. 3 days later, I took the bus to a discount department store near the highway. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed as teenagers wandered through the clearance racks, completely ignoring everything around them. I spent nearly an hour pretending to browse calmly while checking every single price tag twice. Finally, near the back of the store, I found it. A simple dark blue dress with long sleeves, soft fabric, and a quiet sort of elegance. The tag read $18. I held it up to the mirror. It wasn't flashy, but it looked respectable, and at my age, respectability is what matters. I bought the dress and brought it home. wrapped carefully in tissue paper as if it were a rare treasure. That night, I laid it out on the kitchen table under the warm yellow light. One of the sleeves needed to be reinforced, the hem was slightly uneven, and there was a loose thread near the zipper. Most people would never have noticed these flaws, but years of sewing had made my eyes far too sharp. So I threaded my needle and began to hand mend every detail. As I worked, memories drifted through my mind just as busy as my hands. I thought about sewing Michael's Halloween costumes when we couldn't afford the store-bought ones, patching his jeans late at night before school, and making ties for Thomas out of scrap fabric because we didn't have the money to buy one for a wedding. Back then, we had almost no money, but we still had dignity and love. That matters far more than people realize. Around 10 that night, my phone vibrated. It was Michael. I answered immediately with a smile. "Hi, sweetheart." His voice sounded slightly distracted. "Hey, Mom, just wanted to make sure you got the invitation email." "I did," I said warmly. "Thank you for inviting me." After a brief silence, he cleared his throat. "Listen, this gala is a pretty big deal. I know there will be investors there, senior partners, lots of important people." His tone made my stomach tighten. "I understand, Michael. And Vanessa is under a lot of stress planning everything," he continued quickly. "So if she seems overwhelmed, don't take it personally." I looked down at the dress sitting on my lap. "Oh," I said softly, "of course." There was another pause. Then he said something that cut deeper than I expected. "Maybe, just try to keep things simple, okay? Just keep it simple." I understood exactly what he meant. Don't say too much, don't act too comfortable, and don't remind people where I came from. But before the pain could register in my voice, I swallowed it down. "I'll be on my best behavior," I said gently. Michael laughed nervously. I didn't mean it like that. But he did. After hanging up, I sat quietly for a long time. Then I picked up the dress and went back to sewing, because mothers are always far too quick to forgive the small hurts. The next afternoon, I pulled my small jewelry box from my dresser drawer. Inside were the pearl earrings Thomas had given me for our 20th anniversary. They weren't real pearls, and we both knew it, but Thomas had saved for months to buy them. "You deserve nice things, too," he had whispered as he helped me put them on. Holding them in my palm now, I smiled sadly. "Help me look decent, Tommy," I whispered to the empty room. By Friday, the dress was ready. I hung it carefully on my closet door and stepped back to admire it. It still didn't look expensive, but it looked clean, elegant, and made with love. Somehow, that was important to me. On Saturday morning, Vanessa called unexpectedly. I nearly spilled my coffee reaching for the phone. "Hello, Abigail." Her voice sounded unusually sweet, too sweet. "Yes, dear. I just wanted to remind you that the gala starts at 7 sharp. Don't be late." "I won't be." "And one more thing," she added breezily. "This event is very formal." "I understand. We are trying to maintain a certain standard." There it was, the real message wrapped in polite tones. I gripped the phone tighter. "I'll do my best," I said quietly. Vanessa chuckled softly. "I'm sure you will." The moment the line went dead, a strange heaviness settled in my chest. It wasn't exactly fear, more like a warning. Still, I refused to let negative thoughts ruin the opportunity. For the rest of the weekend, I focused on hopeful thoughts instead. Maybe Michael really did want me there, maybe things were finally changing, and maybe this dinner could bridge the growing distance between us. Sunday evening, my friend Rosa came over with sweet bread from the bakery. When she saw the dress hanging nearby, her eyes went wide. "Oh, Abigail, you're going to look beautiful." I laughed softly. Beautiful isn't a word for me anymore. "Yes, it is." She stepped closer and gently touched the sleeve. "You mended this yourself, didn't you? You always have a way of making things look far more valuable than they are." After she left, her words stayed with me, because that had always been my life, creating beautiful things out of almost nothing. Late that night, unable to sleep, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and tried on the dress for the first time. I adjusted the earrings, smoothed down the fabric at my waist, and turned slowly from side to side. An older woman looked back at me. Dark hair mixed with gray, tired eyes surrounded by wrinkles, and hands shaped by decades of hard work. But there was something else there, too, strength. The kind of strength a woman earns quietly over time. I remembered Michael as a little boy, reaching for my hand on his first day of school, Thomas smiling proudly at his graduation, and all the years we had made it through together. Suddenly, I realized a painful truth. I wasn't afraid of wealthy strangers judging me. I was afraid that my own son already had. The next morning, while folding laundry in the living room, I heard my phone vibrate again. Unknown number. I answered cautiously. "Hello." A calm, professional male voice replied immediately. "Mrs. Hernandez." "Yes." "I'm Jonathan Reed, executive assistant to Mr. Charles Whitmore." My heart stopped. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "Who?" "Mr. Whitmore. He wanted me to confirm if you will be attending the gala next Saturday." I sat down slowly on the couch. How? How does he even know I was invited? After a brief pause, the assistant replied carefully. "Ma'am, Mr. Whitmore has been looking forward to seeing you again for a very long time." The gala was held at the Grand Plaza Hotel in downtown Dallas. I had never seen such a luxurious place in my entire life. The building itself looked like a palace made of glass and gold. Valets in crisp black uniforms opened car doors under massive crystal chandeliers hanging outside the entrance. Women stepped out wearing designer gowns, wearing diamonds that sparkled brighter than the city lights. And there I was, clutching my worn brown purse with nervous hands, wearing an $18 dress. For a few seconds, I froze near the sidewalk as luxury cars pulled up one after another behind me. I became painfully aware of every wrinkle in my dress, every silver strand in my hair. I almost told the taxi driver to take me back home, but then I remembered the sound of Michael's voice when he invited me. "Mom, maybe you could come." Maybe. It wasn't much of an invitation, but it was enough to keep me standing there. Taking a deep breath, I thanked the driver and walked slowly toward the entrance. The lobby smelled of expensive perfume and polished marble. Soft piano music drifted through the air, and elegantly dressed guests chatted and laughed near towering floral arrangements. Everything looked perfect, including every single person, except me. I spotted Michael almost immediately near the entrance of the ballroom. He was wearing a tailored black tuxedo that probably cost more than I made in a month. For a split second, pride swelled in my chest, strong enough to briefly wipe away my anxiety. That was my boy, my Michael, the one who used to run barefoot through the sprinklers in our small yard. Now he looked like he belonged on the cover of a magazine. When he finally noticed me approaching, his smile appeared just a little too slowly. "Mom," he said, giving me a quick kiss on the cheek, "you made it." "You look so handsome," I whispered. "Thanks." His eyes drifted briefly down to my dress. It wasn't an admiring look, it was an assessment. I noticed his hesitation before he managed another smile. "You look nice." Nice, the polite word people use when they don't think you look beautiful. Before I could reply, Vanessa appeared by his side, wearing a silver gown that fit her perfectly. Diamonds sparkled around her neck under the ballroom lights. She looked like the kind of woman who had never spent a single day of her life worrying about the price of groceries. "Abigail," she said brightly, too brightly, "you're here." I smiled politely. "Of course." Her gaze slowly traveled down my dress. I watched as she took in the simple fabric, the hand-sewn sleeves, the sensible shoes. A look of self-satisfaction flashed across her face before vanishing beneath another perfect smile. "Well," she said easily, "I suppose simple elegance never goes out of style." I knew it was an insult the moment I heard it, but years of surviving difficult people had taught me how to pretend I didn't understand. "Thank you," I replied softly. Vanessa immediately took Michael's arm. "We should introduce her to a few people," she whispered to him, though not quietly enough. Michael nodded awkwardly. And just like that, I became a social obligation. Vanessa escorted me through groups of wealthy guests, introducing me with the same uncomfortable smile every single time. This is Michael's mother. Not Abigail, not Mrs. Hernandez, just Michael's mother. An accessory, a footnote. Some shook my hand politely. Others barely looked at me before turning back to conversations about investments, vacation homes, and private schools. At one point, a woman wearing emerald earrings asked me where I lived. San Antonio, I replied warmly. Oh, she said, a single word loaded with judgment. Another man asked if I was retired. I still do some sewing from home from time to time, I explained. His smile tightened instantly. You could almost see the moment people mentally downgraded me the second they heard the word sewing. It is amazing how quickly wealth decides who is worthy of respect. Eventually, Michael drifted away to talk to some executives near the bar. Vanessa followed him, and suddenly, I found myself standing alone near a large display of white roses, hundreds of strangers moving around me as if I were invisible. I took a glass of water from a passing tray, mostly just to give my hands something to do. That was when I noticed a few people staring at me, not with amusement, but with curiosity. An older gentleman near the ballroom entrance squinted, as if trying to recall a memory. Another gray-haired woman whispered to her husband while glancing in my direction. At first, I assumed they were judging my appearance too, but then something strange happened. A hotel staff member walked carefully up to me. He looked to be about 65, wearing a crisp black service uniform and silver-rimmed glasses. The moment he stopped in front of me, his entire expression changed. It was a look of recognition. "Mrs. Hernandez?" he asked softly. I blinked in surprise. "Yes." His eyes widened slightly. "Oh, my goodness," he whispered. "I knew it was you." I stared at him, confused. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" The man smiled warmly. "No, ma'am, but I've seen pictures of you." A chill ran down my spine. Pictures. Before he could answer, another server called his name from across the room. He looked back reluctantly. "My apologies," he said quickly. "It's just, Mr. Whitmore speaks very highly of you." My heart stopped for half a second. Charles Whitmore. Just hearing the name brought back old memories. The man smiled respectfully once more before walking away. Once he left, I stood frozen because I could feel it now. Something strange was happening tonight, something far bigger than I could understand. "Mom." I turned around to find Michael approaching again, though this time he looked anxious. "Is everything okay?" he whispered. "Yes," I replied slowly, studying his face. "You never told me Mr. Whitmore was going to be here tonight." Michael looked confused. "He owns the company. Of course he's going to be here." I managed a tight smile. "Right, of course." But my chest was already tightening with anxiety. I hadn't seen Charles Whitmore in over 35 years. Not since the night Thomas and I sat in our cramped kitchen, listening to him admit he was completely broke. Back then, he looked exhausted and desperate. Now, he was one of the most powerful businessmen in the country. It is incredible how life can change people in ways that seem impossible until you see it for yourself. "Mom," Michael said, suddenly lowering his voice, "just try to relax tonight." "I am relaxed." "You just look a little out of place." I almost laughed at the irony. Out of place. I was standing in a world built for people who spent their entire lives being told they were important. People like me usually entered through the service entrance. Still, I nodded politely. "I'm fine, sweetheart." Michael gave another distracted smile, then looked past my shoulder toward a group of executives waving him over. "I have to take care of something. Vanessa will keep you company." But Vanessa did no such thing. The second Michael walked away, she stepped closer and whispered quietly, "Try not to look so nervous, Abigail. People can sense when you don't belong." And then she walked away, before I could even think of a response. Once again, I was left standing alone, feeling dismissed and invisible. For the first time all evening, I suddenly wished I had never come. I reached into my purse and felt Thomas's old folded handkerchief that he used to carry everywhere. That tiny gesture always had a way of grounding me. But before I could fully compose myself, I heard laughter rising behind me. It was Vanessa's voice. Somehow, I already knew that laugh was about to become my nightmare. Vanessa's laughter carried across the ballroom like shattering glass, sharp, cold, and impossible to ignore. At first, I tried to pretend it had nothing to do with me. Keeping my head down, I quietly sipped my water while the guests continued to mingle under the golden chandeliers. But then, I heard my name. "So, Abigail," Vanessa said loudly, smiling at the small group gathered around her. "You still haven't told us where you bought your dress." Several women turned to face me immediately. I froze. Vanessa tilted her champagne glass carelessly, amusement dancing in her eyes. "It's vintage, right?" she continued. "Or custom-made." The woman next to her snickered. I understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't curiosity. It was a performance, and I was the punchline. Michael was standing nearby, talking to two executives. I waited for him to notice the tension building around us, but he didn't, or perhaps he chose not to. I managed a polite smile. "Oh, it's nothing special." Vanessa took a step closer. "No, tell us," she insisted sweetly. "I'm absolutely dying to know." A voice inside me whispered to keep quiet, but I had spent my entire life telling the truth, even when it was difficult. So I answered honestly. "I found it on clearance," I said quietly. $18. The silence lasted for less than a second before Vanessa burst into laughter. It was a genuine laugh, loud enough to make several people in the ballroom turn their heads. $18, she repeated, nearly breathless with amusement. A few people around her joined in. One man covered his mouth, trying to hide a smirk, while another woman looked at my dress with clear pity. Vanessa shook her head dramatically. "My goodness," she said. "Well, that explains it." More snickers followed. I felt the heat rush to my face, and for a moment I thought I might faint. All the insecurity I had carried into this ballroom suddenly tightened around my throat. The cheap fabric, the old shoes, the hand-sewn details. In one cruel moment, all my hard work had become a joke. I looked at Michael, silently pleading. "Please say something, anything." For a brief second, our eyes met across the crowd. I saw a flash of embarrassment on his face. Not embarrassment for me, but embarrassment because of me. He stepped over quickly, lowering his voice. "Vanessa," he muttered. "Stop it." But he was smiling awkwardly too, as if he wanted the moment to pass without causing a scene. Vanessa patted his arm dismissively. "Oh, I'm sorry," she laughed. "I didn't realize cheap fashion was our theme tonight." A few guests chuckled again. Michael rubbed the back of his neck, then looked at me. "Mom," he said softly, "maybe you shouldn't talk about the price like that." That hurt worse than all the laughter combined, because suddenly I realized something terrible. My son wasn't ashamed of their behavior. He was ashamed of me. I stared at him in disbelief. Was this the same little boy who used to go to school in thrift store sneakers because I couldn't afford better? The boy who had cried happy tears when I surprised him with a second-hand bicycle one Christmas. Back then, we had been poor together. Now, he acted as if poverty belonged to me alone. The noise of the ballroom blurred around me. I could barely breathe. Noticing the pain on my face, Vanessa smiled slightly and took another sip of champagne. "I just think appearances matter at an event like this," she said casually to the group. "Especially when you are representing someone important." Representing someone important. As if I were a stain threatening Michael's polished image. I gripped my purse tightly. Inside was Thomas's folded handkerchief. Touching it, I suddenly remembered another night long ago. Thomas had sat at our kitchen table after a wealthy customer had insulted my handmade clothes. "You listen to me," he had said firmly, framing my face with his rough hands. "There is absolutely no shame in honest work." I could almost hear his voice in my ear, but the memory only made the heartache worse. A woman near Vanessa leaned in and whispered loudly enough for me to hear. I can't believe she actually admitted the price. Vanessa laughed again. That's the best part. Something broke inside my chest. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was enough to change things forever. I looked at Michael one last time, but he avoided my eyes. That was when I realized I was completely alone in this room. A server carrying a silver tray of champagne glided past, and the sparkling ballroom suddenly felt suffocating. Everyone looked beautiful, expensive, and confident, while I felt like a foolish old woman pretending to belong in a place I never should have entered. I slowly stood up from my chair. Vanessa noticed immediately. "Oh no," she said, putting on a show of concern. "You're not upset, are you?" I forced my trembling hands to remain still. "No," I whispered. "I think I'm just tired." Michael finally looked at me directly. "So you're leaving?" His tone sounded more annoyed than concerned. I nodded gently. "It's a long drive back to San Antonio." Vanessa shrugged lightly. "Well, thank you for coming." Thank you for coming. As if I were a guest at a business meeting rather than his mother. I picked up my purse carefully, praying my tears wouldn't fall before I reached the parking lot. As I turned to walk away, whispers followed me. $18. Did you see her shoes? That's Michael's mother. Every word felt like a blow. Near the entrance, I stopped by a marble pillar to catch my breath. My chest ached. It wasn't because strangers had laughed at me. Strangers can't truly hurt you. Only family can do that. I reached into my purse to get my phone to call a cab. Just then, the screen lit up with a text from an unknown number. I opened it slowly. "He is looking for you." My heart skipped a beat. Before I could process it, another message appeared. "Mr. Whitmore just arrived." I stared at the words in confusion. Charles Whitmore. After all these years, why would he be looking for me? I looked back at the ballroom. The atmosphere had completely shifted. People were standing up straighter, staff were moving quickly through the hall, and excitement was spreading through the guests. "The CEO is here." "He just arrived." "Charles Whitmore is coming in." Vanessa immediately rushed to the center of the room, smoothing her silver dress and adjusting her smile. Michael nervously straightened his tuxedo. Everyone was suddenly desperate to make a good impression, but I remained frozen by the door, my phone trembling in my hand. Because deep down, I knew everything was about to change. And for the first time since entering that ballroom, Vanessa didn't feel like the most intimidating person in the room anymore. The moment Charles Whitmore entered, the room transformed. Conversations dropped to hushed whispers, executives adjusted their jackets, and women stood taller. Even the servers moved with more urgency. Near the entrance, I remained frozen by the marble column, my pulse racing. "Mr. Whitmore just arrived." The text still felt surreal. I hadn't seen Charles in 35 years, a lifetime. I had thought about leaving before he came in, wanting to slip away into the night before old memories resurfaced. But another part of me, the younger self buried beneath years of struggle, needed to know if he still remembered. Across the room, Vanessa's demeanor had completely changed. Her sharp, critical attitude was replaced by polished grace. She stood in the center of the ballroom, her hand on Michael's arm, smiling at every passing executive. I watched her smooth her silver dress for the third time in a minute, eager to impress Charles Whitmore, just like everyone else. Michael noticed me still standing near the exit and walked over quickly. "Mom," he whispered, "where are you going?" I was heading home, but now... I studied his face, looking for any hint of guilt or regret for what had just happened. Instead, he just looked anxious about appearances. "You should stay," he muttered. "The CEO is about to speak." I nearly laughed at the irony. Moments ago, he had stood by silently while people laughed at my $18 dress. Now, suddenly, he wanted me by his side. "I don't think I belong here," I said softly. Michael sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Mom, please don't do this." "Do what?" "Don't make tonight harder than it already is." Those words hit me like cold water. "Harder?" I stared at my son in disbelief. "Am I really that much of an embarrassment to you?" I asked quietly. His expression shifted. I didn't mean it like that. But you thought it. Michael looked away first, which told me everything I needed to know. For a few painful moments, neither of us spoke. The ballroom lights caught his tuxedo while memories flooded back, nearly overwhelming me. I remembered Michael at 7, crying because other boys made fun of his worn-out backpack. Michael at 13, apologizing after I found him using a black marker to cover holes in his shoes. Michael at 17, promising he would never forget where he came from. And now, here we stood. My son dressed in luxury, while I stood before him feeling smaller than I had in years. I never cared about the money, I whispered. Michael let out an impatient breath. It's not about the money. No, I said sadly. It's about the shame. His jaw tightened. You're overreacting. That comment hurt more than Vanessa's laughter. Cruelty from strangers is one thing, but being dismissed by your own child is a completely different kind of pain. Before I could reply, Vanessa appeared beside us. There you are, she said to Michael with a bright smile. Charles is coming in any second. Then she looked at me. Oh, you're still here. Still here, as if my presence was a chore. Michael said quickly, Mom was just about to leave. A flicker of relief crossed Vanessa's face. Oh, she said. Well, if you're tired. For the first time all night, I looked her in the eyes. Vanessa was beautiful, perfectly styled and confident. But beneath it all, I noticed something else. Fear. Not of me, but of losing her status. People like Vanessa build their identity on social approval, surviving on the admiration of others. Tonight, for the first time, something threatened her carefully maintained image. I should go, I repeated quietly. Michael nodded quickly. That's probably for the best. Those words felt like the ultimate betrayal. I offered a faint smile to keep from crying, adjusted my purse, and turned toward the exit. Just then, the speakers crackled, and a voice echoed through the room. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcer said, please welcome the chairman and CEO of Whitmore Capital Group, Mr. Charles Whitmore. Applause erupted. Everyone turned toward the grand staircase, including me. And there he was, older with graying hair and a commanding presence, but unmistakably Charles. He walked down the stairs as camera flashes lit up the room. Executives moved forward, hopping for a handshake, but Charles didn't seem to notice them. His eyes scanned the room, searching. At first, I thought I was imagining it. Then his gaze locked onto me. My breath caught. Everything around us seemed to fade. The music, the applause, the chatter. For a moment, 35 years felt like nothing. Charles Whitmore stared at me with an expression of shock, emotion, and relief. Then, something happened that no one in the room expected. Instead of greeting the board members waiting by the stage, Charles changed direction. The crowd parted as he walked quickly and purposefully through the room. Straight toward me. Whispers immediately began to spread. Where is he going? Who is that woman? Does he know her? As Charles approached, Vanessa stood taller, her smile widening. For a brief, awkward second, I think she assumed he was walking toward her. She even raised her chin slightly. But Charles didn't look at Vanessa, or Michael, or anyone else. His focus was entirely on me. My hands began to shake as memories of our last meeting came back clearly. A young, desperate man sitting in my kitchen, tears in his eyes, admitting he had nothing left. Now, he stood before me as one of the wealthiest men in the country. When he finally stopped just inches away, the ballroom went silent. I saw the confusion on Michael's face, while Vanessa looked stunned. Charles stared at me for a few emotional moments before speaking quietly. Abigail. Hearing my name in his voice after all this time almost brought me to tears. I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. Then, before anyone could react, Charles Whitmore stepped forward and hugged me tightly, like family, with deep gratitude. Gasps echoed through the room. Glasses remained suspended in midair. Vanessa turned pale. Near my ear, Charles whispered the words that changed everything. I never forgot what you did for me. For several seconds, no one in the ballroom moved. Charles Whitmore kept holding me close as hundreds of guests stared in stunned silence. The room was so quiet you could hear a glass clink in the back. When Charles finally stepped back, his hands rested gently on my shoulders, as if to convince himself I was actually there. His eyes were filled with emotion. Suddenly, beneath the polished billionaire, I saw the young man he used to be. "It really is you, Abigail," he said softly, shaking his head. "After all these years." I found my voice. "You remember me." Charles let out a soft laugh. "Remember you? Not a year has gone by that I haven't thought of you." Whispers quickly spread through the room. People looked confused, wondering why one of the most powerful CEOs in the country was treating an older woman in an $18 dress like the most important person there. I looked over at Michael, whose face was completely pale. Beside him, Vanessa stood frozen. Just minutes ago, she had ridiculed me in front of everyone, and now, the CEO was standing by my side with immense respect. Charles turned to the crowd, keeping a protective arm around me. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said firmly, "I want to introduce you to the woman who changed my life." The silence grew deeper. Vanessa blinked rapidly, and Michael looked like he couldn't breathe. An executive in the front row laughed nervously, assuming it was a joke. But Charles wasn't smiling. Instead, he looked at me with sincere respect. "If it weren't for Abigail Hernandez," he continued, "Whitmore Capital would not exist today." A wave of shocked whispers went through the room. I looked down, overwhelmed by the attention. "No, Charles," I whispered. "You built this company yourself." He shook his head. "I built it because you gave me the chance to survive." Michael suddenly stepped forward. "Sir," he said carefully, "I think there must be some mistake." Charles turned to him, the atmosphere instantly shifting. "A mistake," Charles repeated calmly. Michael swallowed. "I mean, my mother has never mentioned knowing you." Charles stared at him for a long moment, then asked quietly, "She never told you?" "No, sir." Charles's expression softened into a look of quiet pain. He shook his head, looking at me in disbelief. "All these years, Abigail, you actually kept your word." I offered him a sad, gentle smile. "I told you back then, Charles. Michael needed to earn his own way in this world." Vanessa looked completely lost. Her eyes darted back and forth between us, desperately trying to make sense of the conversation unfolding in front of everyone. Charles turned back to face the crowd. 35 years ago," he began slowly, "I was broke, completely and utterly bankrupted." The ballroom fell dead silent once more. Debt collectors called me every single day. Banks refused to even give me a meeting. Investors laughed in my face and kicked me out of their offices. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "At one point, I was sleeping in my car because I couldn't even afford rent." Nobody moved. Nobody even dared to take a loud breath. It is a rare thing to hear a billionaire speak so candidly about failure. Charles looked down at me, his eyes full of warmth. "And then I met Abigail and her husband, Thomas." Hearing Thomas's name made my chest tighten instantly. "They ran a tiny tailor shop in San Antonio," Charles continued. "Nothing fancy, just honest, hardworking people trying to make a living." Memories immediately rushed back to me. The little shop with the faded curtains, Thomas humming as he patched jackets, and the scent of coffee and fabric filling the air late into the night. Back then, we barely had enough money for ourselves. But Thomas always believed that kindness was more important than comfort. Charles smiled, lost in his own memories. "I walked into their shop during the worst week of my life. My suit was torn, and I didn't have a penny to pay for the repairs." He let out a soft laugh. "Honestly, I probably looked like a vagrant." A few guests offered polite, nervous chuckles, but no one dared interrupt him. "Most people avoided me back then," Charles said softly. "I looked like a lost cause." His gaze found mine again. "But Abigail sat me down, poured me a cup of coffee, and she listened." The ballroom remained absolutely quiet. "She listened to me for nearly 2 hours," Charles went on. About my business ideas, the company I dreamed of building, and all the doors that had been slammed in my face. I remembered that conversation so clearly now. A much younger Charles, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, his hands shaking as he held a mismatched mug. There is a very specific kind of sadness in a desperate man. Thomas and I recognized it immediately because we had lived it too. I still remember what Thomas said that night, Charles said, and my throat tightened. Charles smiled gently. He looked at Abigail and said, "Sometimes good people just need someone to believe in them." Tears instantly filled my eyes. That was Thomas. He always chose to believe in people long before they believed in themselves. Charles took a slow breath and continued. The next morning, Abigail called me back to the shop. I closed my eyes briefly. I remembered that morning too. Thomas and I had stayed up almost all night, talking about whether we were crazy. The amount we planned to give Charles represented nearly every penny we had saved from years of hard work. It was our emergency fund, the money meant for Michael's future, the safety net that protected our survival. But there was something so genuine about Charles, and Thomas trusted my intuition completely. Charles looked around the massive ballroom. Abigail and Thomas handed me an envelope. Inside was almost their entire life savings. Gasps rippled through the room. Michael's eyes widened in sheer disbelief, and Vanessa looked utterly horrified. I kept my eyes on the floor. Hearing the story out loud made the sacrifice feel so incredibly vast all over again. "I tried to refuse," Charles said softly. "I told them it was too much, that I might fail." His voice cracked slightly. "But Abigail said something I will never forget." He turned to face me fully. "You looked at me and said, 'If you make it, promise me you'll stay kind.'" My tears finally spilled over. I remembered saying exactly that, back when success felt like a distant, impossible dream for all of us. Charles swallowed hard. That money kept my company afloat just long enough for one investor to finally say yes. He paused. That single yes changed everything. Silence gripped the ballroom. Then Charles added softly, "I spent years trying to pay them back." I shook my head gently. "You already did." "No," he said firmly. "Nowhere near enough." Beside Vanessa, Michael looked unsteady. "You gave him your savings," he whispered to me. I looked at my son. "Yes, Michael, most of it." Michael stared at me as if he were looking at a stranger. Perhaps he was. Children rarely understand the true depth of their parents' sacrifices until they are forced to look at them with honest eyes. Vanessa finally found her voice. "But if that's true," she stammered, "why does Abigail still live so simply?" Charles slowly turned his attention to her. The tension in the room spiked instantly. When he spoke, his voice was as cold and sharp as cracked ice. "Because unlike most people in this room, Abigail Hernandez has never measured the worth of a human being by their bank account." Vanessa's face turned bright red. A few guests nearby quickly looked away in embarrassment. For the first time all night, she was completely speechless. An unnatural silence fell over the ballroom. Suddenly, everyone in the room was looking at me differently. It wasn't pity and it wasn't amusement. It was respect, something that, to someone like Vanessa, is far more uncomfortable. I wished they wouldn't. Being the center of attention had always made me uneasy. Thomas used to joke that I could sew wedding dresses for strangers all day, but if anyone complimented my own shirt, I would panic. So, with hundreds of eyes locked on me under the glittering chandeliers, I wanted nothing more than to slip away back to the quiet life I understood. But Charles wasn't done. He gently guided me toward a chair near the front of the ballroom. "Sit with me," he said softly. "I'm fine standing, Charles." "You've spent a lifetime standing on your feet." The warmth in his voice was overwhelming. I sat down slowly, and the whispers continued around us. Michael and Vanessa remained standing nearby, both looking entirely overwhelmed in their own ways. Michael looked utterly bewildered. Vanessa looked terrified. Charles took a glass of water from a server and addressed the crowd once more. "There is something else you all need to understand," he said quietly. I shook my head. "Charles, please." But he only smiled. "No more hiding, Abigail." Those words carried a heavy weight. For years, hiding had become second nature to me. Hiding the struggle, the sacrifice, the pain, and especially hiding it all from Michael. Charles crossed his hands thoughtfully. When Abigail and Thomas helped me, they weren't wealthy people making an easy investment. They risked absolutely everything they had. Several guests lowered their eyes, perhaps trying to picture themselves making a sacrifice like that, knowing they never could. I stared down at my hands, the memories so vivid that the ballroom around me began to fade. Our shop had been on a narrow street on the edge of San Antonio. The roof leaked whenever it rained hard, and half of our customers paid late because they were struggling too. There were months when Thomas and I barely made enough to keep the lights on, but we survived. I remembered the night Charles first walked in. The rain was pouring, flooding the street outside. I was hemming a bridesmaid dress, and Thomas was sorting receipts at the counter. Then the door opened, and a young man stepped in, wearing a soaked gray suit with a torn sleeve, his face lined with exhaustion. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "I know you're probably closing." Thomas looked up and smiled instantly. "No problem at all. Come on in." That was Thomas, always putting kindness first. Charles explained that he needed his jacket repaired before an important investor meeting the next morning. "I can pay you later," he admitted awkwardly. I remembered seeing the embarrassment in his eyes, the sting of pride wounded by desperation. Thomas glanced at me briefly, then simply said, "We'll take care of it." No judgment, no suspicion, just grace. While Thomas worked on the jacket, Charles and I sat at the sewing table in the back, drinking coffee from our mismatched mugs. Somehow, he began to pour his heart out. The business he dreamed of building, the technology no one believed in, the banks that rejected him, the mounting debts, and the fear of failure that kept him up at night. "I know how crazy it sounds," he said with a defeated laugh. "Honestly, I think people look at me and just see someone chasing an impossible dream." I remembered replying softly, "Sometimes, impossible dreams just need a little more time." Charles smiled as he recounted that moment. "She believed in me before there was anything to believe in," he told the room. I looked down, embarrassed by the praise, but the truth was far more complicated. It wasn't about believing in his success, it was about recognition. Thomas and I recognized the struggle because we were living in it ourselves. After Charles left the shop that night, Thomas and I sat at our small kitchen table, the rain beating heavily against the window. "He was telling the truth," I whispered. Thomas nodded slowly. "I know." I could see how desperate he is. "I know that too." We sat in silence for a few minutes before I looked at him. "What if we help him?" Thomas studied me, showing no anger or shock, just deep thought. "How much are you talking about?" I swallowed hard. Everything. Even now, 35 years later, I still remember the silence that followed. Because everything meant our savings account, every single extra dollar we had saved over years of hard work. It was our safety net, the money meant to protect Michael's future, the only thing standing between our family and disaster. Finally, Thomas leaned back in his chair and let out a deep sigh. "You trust him?" "I do." Thomas stared at his rough hands for a long time, then smiled sadly. "Well," he said softly, "you've always had a bigger heart than me." "No," I replied with tears in my eyes, "just a more reckless one." He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "No, Abigail," he whispered, "a brave one." Back in the ballroom, I blinked away my tears as Charles continued speaking. "The next morning," he said, "they handed me an envelope containing nearly every penny they had." Several guests looked visibly moved, especially the older ones. Older people understand sacrifice differently. We know what it means to hand over your security, your future, and your hope to someone else. I asked them why, Charles continued softly. "Why risk so much for a stranger?" He looked directly at me again. And then Abigail said something that changed my life. I closed my eyes briefly, already knowing what was coming. She said, "Money comes and goes, but if kindness disappears, the world becomes unbearable." The room fell quiet again. Hearing my own words repeated after all these years made me feel incredibly small. At the time, those words hadn't felt wise or noble. They had simply felt true. Charles offered a faint smile. That phrase stayed with me through every success. Michael slowly sat down nearby, his face still pale. He stared at me as if seeing his own mother clearly for the very first time. "I don't understand," he said softly. "Why did you never tell me any of this?" I turned to him slowly. "You were so young, Michael," I said gently. "But this was huge, Mom." "No," I replied softly. "You were the only thing that was huge to us." Michael frowned slightly. "Your father and I never wanted you to grow up believing that success was something handed to you through connections or favors," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "We wanted you to build your own strength." Michael was speechless. Charles nodded beside me. "She made me promise never to interfere with your future unless it was absolutely necessary." Vanessa looked thoroughly confused. "What do you mean by interfere?" Charles's expression hardened. "Michael's business school scholarship." Michael blinked. "What about it?" Charles kept his gaze steady. "It existed because your mother privately asked me to establish it." Another collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. Michael looked visibly shaken. "No," he whispered. "That scholarship was merit-based." "It was," Charles replied. "You earned it. But after your father passed away, when the tuition became impossible to manage, Abigail quietly came to my office." My chest tightened at the memory. I had hated that meeting, hating the need to ask for help, especially after spending a lifetime trying to be self-sufficient. But Thomas had passed away only 3 months prior, and the medical bills had consumed nearly all of our savings. Meanwhile, Michael's business school acceptance letter sat on our kitchen table like a dream we couldn't afford. I still remembered him saying, "Maybe I should wait a year, Mom." He wanted to wait because he knew we couldn't pay for it. That night, after Michael fell asleep on the couch, I sat alone in the dark, staring at Thomas's picture for nearly 2 hours. The next morning, I called Charles. Not for a handout, never for a handout. I only asked for an opportunity. I didn't want him to carry the weight of our struggles, I said softly. Now, Michael looked completely broken. "You sold Dad's truck after he died," he said slowly, as if putting the pieces of a puzzle together. "You told me it was because you didn't need it anymore." I lowered my eyes. "That money paid for your first semester's housing deposit." His face contorted slightly. "And the life insurance went mostly to medical debt." Michael covered his mouth with a trembling hand. Around us, the ballroom remained dead silent. No one wanted to interrupt anymore. This was no longer entertainment. It was deeply personal, human, and raw. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably beside him, clearly desperate for the attention to shift elsewhere. But Charles wasn't finished. "There is one more thing everyone here should know," he said firmly. I looked up quickly. "Charles, please." He offered a gentle smile. "No more keeping the truth from people." Vanessa visibly froze at his words. Charles turned back to the crowd. "When Abigail first invested in my company, I offered her formal shares." Whispers immediately broke out again. Nearby investors exchanged shocked glances. "But she refused to profit from my desperation," Charles continued. "So, I created what is called a legacy agreement." Michael frowned. "What is that?" Charles looked directly at him. "It means your mother still holds honorary founding shares in Whitmore Capital." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Vanessa nearly dropped her champagne glass, while Michael stared blankly. Charles remained perfectly calm. "It has been that way for 35 years. I closed my eyes, feeling overwhelmed once again. Those shares had never meant much to me personally. I rarely even thought about them. But Charles had insisted all those years ago. "If this company survives," he had told me, "a piece of it will always belong to the Hernandez family." At the time, I thought he was just being emotional and grateful. Neither of us had any idea that Whitmore Capital would become a multi-billion-dollar empire. Michael looked completely stunned. "Mom," he whispered, "why didn't you ever tell me?" I met his gaze gently, because I didn't want you to grow up with a sense of entitlement. His face tightened with emotion. I'm your son. Yes, I said softly, and that is exactly why I wanted you to build your own life. Vanessa suddenly found her voice again. Well, honorary shares don't necessarily mean financial ownership, she said quickly, forcing a tight, nervous smile. The desperation in her tone was obvious. She needed this revelation to be small to make it less humiliating. Charles slowly turned to her. They include annual dividends, he said calmly. Vanessa went entirely pale. A few nearby executives looked embarrassed for her, as everyone in the room now understood the reality of what she had done. She had ridiculed an older woman in an $18 dress, entirely unaware that the woman quietly owned a piece of the company her husband worked for. But the truth ran much deeper than that. My humiliation hadn't been about being poor. It was about the assumption that simplicity meant worthlessness. Charles stepped closer to me. Abigail has quietly donated almost every single dividend payment over the years, he continued. Even I was surprised. Charles, how did you? It's true, he turned to the audience. She anonymously funded employee hardship programs, education grants, and emergency assistance for widows. He paused, and she never wanted an ounce of recognition. Michael stared at me, his expression full of heartbreak. You gave it away, he whispered. I gave a small shrug. There were people who needed it far more than I did. Vanessa blinked rapidly. But if you had all that money, she stammered, why live like that? The question hung heavily in the air. Charles looked disappointed by the question, but honestly, I wasn't angry. People like Vanessa truly believe that wealth exists solely to display superiority. The idea of having resources and not showing them off was entirely foreign to her. I answered before Charles could. Because money only changes who you are if you worship it, I said calmly. Silence fell over the ballroom once more. Thomas and I were surrounded by hardworking people our entire lives, I continued softly. Some had money, some didn't, but the kindest people we ever met were usually the ones who understood what it meant to struggle. Vanessa lowered her head immediately. For the first time all night, she seemed unable to maintain her polished confidence. Meanwhile, Michael looked emotionally devastated. Tears filled his eyes as the memories of all the birthdays, the tuition payments, and the sacrifices he had never questioned came back to him. I had never allowed him to see the cost. You still worked part-time after Dad died, he whispered suddenly. I nodded slightly. You told me it was because you liked staying busy. I needed the insurance, Michael. He closed his eyes briefly. And the nights you sounded so tired on the phone. I smiled sadly. I usually finished sewing around 2 in the morning. Michael looked away, unable to hide his tears. That moment hurt me almost as much as the initial humiliation. No mother wants to see her child carry such deep guilt, even if they deserve to feel some of it. Charles placed a hand gently on Michael's shoulder. Your mother worked tirelessly to protect your future, he said softly. Everything she did was out of love. Michael nodded, his shoulders shaking. Then he turned to me, and for the first time tonight, his expression was filled with genuine shame, not for me, but for himself. The glittering atmosphere of the ballroom had completely vanished, replaced by the weight of the truth. The crystal chandeliers still sparkled overhead, champagne still flowed, and the string quartet near the stage still played soft music. But beneath all the elegance, a raw, uncomfortable reality had taken over the room. And reality is never as flawless as wealth tries to make it seem. Michael stood frozen just a few feet away, pale and exhausted. The confident executive from earlier was gone, replaced by a lost boy. I hadn't seen him look this way since the day Thomas died. Mom, he said, his voice cracking on the word. My chest tightened. No matter how deeply our children hurt us, hearing them break still strikes a chord in a mother's heart. I stood up slowly, smoothing the creases of my cheap navy dress out of habit. Michael looked down at the fabric, the dress he had silently allowed others to mock. The realization clearly hit him all over again. I didn't know, he whispered. I gave him a small, sad smile. I know. No, you don't understand. He shook his head quickly. I really had no idea about any of this. Charles remained nearby, but wisely kept quiet. This was no longer his moment. It belonged to a mother and son standing amid the ruins of years of misunderstanding. Michael swallowed hard. All those times you said you were fine. His eyes welled up again. You weren't fine at all. I looked at him gently. Parents rarely tell their children how afraid they are. Those words seemed to break something inside him. He covered his mouth briefly, struggling to control his emotions. A few nearby guests respectfully looked away, pretending not to listen, though they heard every word. Hardship has a way of humbling people, and tonight, my son was finally learning that lesson. I thought, Michael struggled to find his breath, I thought Dad's life insurance covered everything. It was enough to help us survive, but with your tuition. I nodded gently. There were still bills. His gaze fell to my hands, old hands, shaped by decades of sewing, scrubbing, carrying, and surviving. Hands he had stopped truly looking at years ago. I watched as he noticed, perhaps for the first time in a very long time, the tiny scars near my fingers, the small white marks left by decades of sewing needles. Thomas used to playfully kiss those scars, calling them my medals of love. Michael stared at them in silence. Then he asked quietly, "How many times did you skip meals?" The ballroom was so quiet I could hear the faint clink of a glass being set down nearby. I hadn't expected that question, not because it wasn't true, but because I never thought Michael would think to ask. I tried to offer a light laugh. "Oh, sweetheart." "Please," he whispered, "don't lie to me anymore." My throat tightened, so I told him the truth. "Sometimes at the end of the month," I admitted softly, but it wasn't a big deal. Michael closed his eyes, as if the words physically pained him. Perhaps they did. When children realize their parents were hiding hunger, their memories of those years change completely. I remembered one winter especially clearly. Michael was 16. His school was hosting an expensive academic competition trip to Austin, and he desperately wanted to go. By wealthy standards, the fee wasn't high, but for us, it was nearly impossible. That month, Thomas and I quietly lived on canned soup and toast for nearly 2 weeks just to pay for it. Michael never knew, or so I thought. "I used to hear you in the kitchen late at night," Michael said suddenly. I studied his face. "Did you?" "You thought I was asleep." His voice trembled. "Sometimes I heard you crying." Tears filled my eyes. Mothers always believe they are much better at hiding their pain than they actually are. "I'm sorry," I whispered. His face contorted in disbelief. "Sorry," he repeated. "Mom, why are you apologizing to me?" Because mothers apologize for everything, for the struggles, the sadness, and the inability to protect their children from life's hardships, even when they have already sacrificed everything. Michael wiped his eyes and looked around the ballroom, his gaze finally landing on Vanessa. She stood a few feet away, entirely isolated from the crowd. The people who had laughed with her earlier were now avoiding eye contact. It is remarkable how quickly cruelty becomes embarrassing when the balance of power shifts. Vanessa folded her arms defensively. "I didn't know any of this either," she said. No one answered, not even Michael. She took a shaky breath. "How could I have known?" Charles finally spoke, his voice calm but cold. "You shouldn't have needed to know she had money," he said. "You should have treated her with dignity regardless." Those words cut through the room like a blade. Vanessa's face flushed deep red. "I never meant." "Yes, you did," Michael interrupted quietly. Everyone looked at him. He didn't raise his voice, which somehow made it worse. "I heard you laughing," he continued, "and I let it happen." He looked back at me. "That's on me." For the first time all evening, I saw genuine accountability in my son's eyes. It wasn't a performance of guilt or embarrassment from being caught. It was real shame, the kind that can actually change a person if they let it. Charles stepped closer to him. "You are talented, Michael," he said quietly. "You work hard and you earned your career." Michael nodded weakly. But character matters far more than talent. The room remained still as Charles continued. I've seen people acquire wealth only to end up completely bankrupt in spirit. His gaze sharpened. Success is meaningless if you forget the people who helped you get there. Michael lowered his head. I know. No, Charles corrected gently. Tonight, you are finally starting to understand. Those words weighed heavily on everyone, especially me. Deep down, I realized something painful too. I had spent so many years protecting Michael from hardship that he had forgotten what hardship looked like. It hadn't happened on purpose. It had happened gradually. Success had surrounded him with polished people, expensive places, and carefully curated images. Without realizing it, he had started to view simplicity as a failure, just like Vanessa did. The difference was that Vanessa had been taught to think that way, while Michael knew better. He had simply forgotten. I failed you tonight, he whispered. I shook my head quickly. No, Michael. I did. Tears streamed down his face. You stood there being ridiculed, and I cared more about appearances than protecting my own mother. Hearing him finally say it out loud touched a deep wound, because that was where the true pain lay. It wasn't Vanessa's cruelty, it was Michael's silence. I stepped closer. You did hurt me tonight, I admitted softly. He flinched slightly. But you are still my son. He looked completely broken. I am so sorry, Mom. The apology sounded raw and real. In that vulnerable moment, I wanted to forgive him instantly. That is the weakness of motherhood. We love before the wounds have even begun to heal. But before I could reply, Charles cleared his throat quietly. There is one more thing, he said. The tension in the ballroom returned. Charles looked directly at Michael. The board was planning to announce your promotion tonight. Michael blinked, confused. My promotion, I was being considered for regional partner. Vanessa's head snapped up, but Charles's expression remained unreadable. Keyword was, he said carefully. A cold silence settled over the room. Michael stared at him, and suddenly everyone understood what those words meant. His future, the promotion he had worked years for, was suddenly on the line. Vanessa knew it too. Any remaining color drained from her face. What does that mean? She asked, her voice sharp. Was being considered. Charles looked at her calmly. It means the board, and I need some additional time before making that decision. Vanessa stared in disbelief. You're delaying his promotion over this. Charles's expression hardened slightly. No, he said evenly. I'm delaying it because leadership is demonstrated in moments like these. The silence in the room became suffocating. Michael kept his head down, but Vanessa wasn't finished. This is ridiculous, she blurted out. Michael is one of the best executives in this company. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Charles remained perfectly composed. I agree, he replied. He is intelligent, ambitious, and capable. Then this shouldn't affect his career. Oh, Charles said softly, it affects it greatly. His voice remained quiet, which somehow made it even more intimidating. Vanessa crossed her arms tightly. So now personal feelings are dictating business decisions. When she said that, I saw Michael close his eyes in frustration. Vanessa still didn't understand the real issue. This was never about my feelings, it was about character. Charles took a step toward her. Mrs. Collins, he said quietly, do you know why I established the Employee Assistance Program at this company? Vanessa hesitated. No. Because I remember what it feels like to be treated as worthless when you're struggling. The room was silent again. Charles continued, I built this company on the belief that success should make people kinder. His eyes narrowed slightly. Not more cruel. Vanessa looked away, her confidence completely shattered for the first time all night. But then anger emerged from beneath her defense. This is unbelievable, she muttered, looking at me. She could have just said something. That comment stung more than I expected. Even now, after everything, Vanessa still thought money was the only thing that mattered, as if my mistake had been not loudly announcing my net worth. Charles looked disappointed, and Michael looked shocked, but Vanessa kept going. You just let everyone assume you were poor. I answered quietly, I am not wealthy, Vanessa. Oh, please, she scoffed. You own a piece of this company. I hold honorary shares that I rarely ever touch. That's still more than most people in this room have. I shook my head gently. You still don't understand. Vanessa let out a bitter laugh. No, I understand perfectly now. You let us embarrass ourselves on purpose. That finally drew a reaction from Michael. Shut up, he snapped. Vanessa turned to him in disbelief. What? You need to stop talking. Her eyes widened. Michael had never spoken to her like that before, but the control he had maintained for years was falling apart around him. She stared at him, stunned. You're actually defending this, she whispered. Michael looked at her as if she were a stranger. My mother was insulted in front of this entire room. Vanessa scoffed. She's fine. That comment changed something in Michael's expression, quietly but decisively, like a final thread snapping. She is not fine, he said softly. And in that moment, I saw my son truly begin to see me again. No longer as a background detail, an obligation, or a simple woman from San Antonio who embarrassed his polished life, but as a person, a mother who had carried him through the hardest years while he had looked right past it. Vanessa glanced around nervously, realizing the crowd was no longer sympathetic to her. People were watching her closely now, judging her with the same critical eyes she had used on me earlier. Desperate to regain control, Vanessa forced a fragile smile and turned to a few nearby guests. I suppose emotions are just running high tonight, she said lightly. Nobody laughed. Nobody came to her rescue. The silence that followed was heavy. Just then, a young server carrying a tray of champagne accidentally bumped into Vanessa from across the ballroom, spilling a few drops on the side of her silver gown. It was a tiny spill. But Vanessa snapped instantly. Watch where you're going, she barked. The server, who looked barely 20, turned pale. I'm so sorry, ma'am. Do you have any idea how expensive this dress is? Vanessa demanded. The ballroom went still again. The server looked terrified. In that young girl's eyes, I saw a deeply familiar look of shame, the kind of shame that wealthy people hand out carelessly. Vanessa continued angrily. This is what happens when the hotel hires careless people. Charles's expression darkened immediately. The young server kept apologizing, her voice trembling. I'm sorry, ma'am, I didn't mean to. Of course you didn't mean to, Vanessa cut her off coldly. But that doesn't change your incompetence. Michael looked horrified. Vanessa, he muttered, but she ignored him. A person's true character is clearest when they believe they are dealing with someone of lower status. Tonight, Vanessa had shown exactly who she was. Charles walked slowly over to the trembling server and gently took the tray from her hands. It's all right, he said softly. Go take a break. The young girl looked close to tears. Thank you, sir, she said, quickly walking away. Then Charles turned back to Vanessa, his disappointment entirely clear. My mother cleaned hotel rooms for 15 years, he said quietly. Vanessa froze. She worked double shifts, and people in expensive clothes spoke to her exactly the way you just spoke to that young woman. Nobody in the ballroom dared to move. One of the fastest ways to understand who a person truly is, Charles continued, his gaze locked on Vanessa, is to watch how they treat people who can do absolutely nothing for them. Vanessa's face turned bright red. Michael looked as though he wished the floor would open up and swallow him. Honestly, I almost felt for him. Because discovering a lack of kindness in your partner is a heartbreaking realization. Charles handed the champagne glasses to another server and spoke once more. Effective immediately, he said calmly. Mrs. Collins will no longer be involved with the Whitmore Foundation's charity board. Gasps rippled through the room. Vanessa blinked rapidly. What? The foundation represents vulnerable families, struggling workers, and scholarship recipients. Charles's voice remained steady. You are clearly not suited for that responsibility. You can't be serious. I am entirely serious. Vanessa looked desperately at Michael. Say something." Michael stared at her in silence for a few seconds. Then came the moment that changed everything. For the first time, my son didn't rush to protect his wife's image. Instead, he looked at her with quiet disappointment. "How many times?" he asked softly. "Did you tell me that sending money to my mother was encouraging dependency?" Vanessa went completely pale. My heart stopped as I suddenly understood as well. Michael looked away in pain. I actually thought that was my own idea. The room went dead silent. Before Vanessa could even open her mouth, her expression had already given away the truth. Michael stared at her, the realization slowly cracking across his face like fractured glass. "All those times," he said softly, almost to himself. "Every single time I wanted to do a little extra for my mother." Vanessa crossed her arms defensively. "I was trying to protect our future." Michael let out a hollow, dry laugh. "Our future." His voice sounded incredibly tired. There was no anger left in it, only exhaustion. "You told me my mother needed to learn to be independent." She did. That single statement finally hardened something in Michael's eyes. I recognized that look immediately. It was the exact expression Thomas used to get whenever someone crossed a line he could no longer forgive. "She raised me by herself after my father died," Michael said quietly. "She worked herself sick to preserve my future." Vanessa opened her mouth to argue, but Michael cut her off. "And tonight, you ridiculed her over a dress." The ballroom around us remained painfully silent. Guests had stopped pretending to look away. This was no longer entertainment. It was the collapse of a carefully constructed facade. Vanessa's polished social mask, Michael's illusion of self-made success, and even my own habit of keeping quiet just to preserve the peace. Everything was fracturing under the light of those crystal chandeliers. Vanessa glanced around nervously, realizing she no longer held any power in the room. "You're making me sound like a monster," she whispered. Michael looked at her in disbelief. "You did that to yourself." Those words seemed to hit her harder than anything Charles had said all evening. Deep down, Vanessa had likely believed that Michael would always choose her version of reality over anyone else's, especially mine. But tonight, my son was finally seeing the whole picture. And the truth has a way of changing people, even when it hurts. I quietly picked up my purse from the chair, a small movement that instantly caught Charles's attention. "Are you leaving?" he asked gently. I nodded. "I think it's time." Michael turned to me immediately. "Mom, wait." "No, sweetheart." I gave him a soft smile, even though my chest still ached. "I've had enough attention for one night." To be honest, a profound exhaustion had suddenly washed over me. It wasn't physical, but emotional. Years of swallowing small hurts had finally surfaced all at once, and my heart was still trying to process it. Charles stepped up beside me. "At least let my driver take you home. You have done more than enough." His expression softened. "Far more than enough." I gently touched his arm. "Thomas would be so proud of the man you've become." A flash of emotion crossed Charles's face. For a brief second, he looked like that struggling young businessman again, not a billionaire, just a man remembering the people who had believed in him when no one else would. "He believed in me before I had anything to offer," Charles said quietly. "He believed in everyone." Charles smiled sadly. "Yes, that is a rare quality." Around us, the guests slowly began to applaud. It started softly, then grew louder and louder. The sound caught me completely off guard. I looked around in confusion as dozens of people, one by one, stood up from their seats. A standing ovation for me. My throat tightened. Just an hour ago, some of these same people had chuckled when Vanessa mocked my $18 dress. Now, they were standing and applauding as if they had respected me all along. It is amazing how quickly public opinion shifts when wealth and power set the direction. But strangely, I didn't feel angry anymore. Only sad, because kindness should never depend on status. I looked down at my dress under the brilliant lights. The hand-mended sleeves, the simple fabric, the cheap shoes. Earlier tonight, wearing it had felt like a humiliation. Now, suddenly, none of it embarrassed me. Dignity is not something wealthy people hand out to you. It is something you carry inside yourself. Michael walked over carefully, his eyes still red. "Mom," he whispered. I looked at him calmly. "I am so sorry." The pain in his voice was real, but some wounds do not heal the moment an apology is offered, even between a mother and her son. "I know you are," I said quietly. Tears filled his eyes again. "I failed you tonight." I swallowed hard. "Yes," I replied honestly, "you did." The truth seemed to break him, but sometimes honesty is far more important than comfort. Michael lowered his head completely. "I don't know how I became this person." My chest tightened with pain because despite everything, hearing your child dislike who they have become is still heartbreaking. I reached out and gently touched his cheek, just like I used to do when he was little. "You are not a bad man, Michael." He closed his eyes. "But tonight," I continued softly, "you were a weak one." Tears streamed down his face, and for the first time all night, he didn't try to hide his pain from the crowd. Taking accountability changes the way a person carries themselves. "I thought success meant fitting in," he whispered. "That's because you spent too much time around people who are afraid of being ordinary." My gaze shifted briefly to Vanessa. She stood frozen a few feet away, entirely isolated. No one was standing near her anymore. The loneliness on her face was stark. Yet, even now, I couldn't bring myself to hate her. Cruel people are often incredibly insecure deep down. Vanessa had built her entire identity on status because she didn't know who she was without it. Her pain explained her behavior, but it didn't excuse it. Charles glanced toward the stage. "They're waiting for my speech," he said softly. I gave a faint smile. "Then don't keep your empire waiting." He let out a quiet laugh, then grew serious again. "Abigail, before you go," he gently took my hand, "you have spent your entire life giving dignity to people when they least deserved it." His eyes shone slightly. "This company exists because of that." Emotion surged through me. No one had ever described my life that way. I had always assumed I was just trying to survive, doing what any mother and decent person would do. Nothing extraordinary. But perhaps in a world hungry for kindness, ordinary decency becomes extraordinary. Charles turned back to the crowd. "Before Mrs. Hernandez leaves tonight," he announced calmly, "there is one thing I want everyone in this room to remember." The ballroom immediately went quiet. Charles looked around slowly before continuing. "A person's worth is never stitched onto a price tag." My breath caught. Those were my words, words I had whispered to a struggling young man in a tiny tailor shop decades ago. Now they were echoing through one of the wealthiest rooms in Texas. Suddenly, my $18 dress didn't feel small at all. The ballroom erupted in applause again, but this time I didn't look down in embarrassment. I stood tall, not because people were finally showing me respect, but because I remembered that I was worthy of it long before they chose to recognize it. Michael walked with me slowly toward the exit. Halfway there, he whispered shakily, "I don't deserve your forgiveness yet." I looked at him. "No," I said softly, "you don't." The reality hit him visibly, but before the shame could entirely overwhelm him, I continued, "But that doesn't mean you can't earn it." For the first time all evening, a faint, fragile look of hope appeared in my son's eyes. 3 days passed before I saw Michael again. 3 long, quiet days. Part of me worried that once the embarrassment faded, he would slip back into his polished life in Dallas. People often experience strong emotions in public, only to return to old habits once comfort is restored. But deep down, I hoped my son was better than that. On the 3rd morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table, hemming a small pink dress for a customer when I heard a knock at the front door. It wasn't the quick tap of a delivery driver or Rose's cheerful knock. It was slow and hesitant. Before I even opened it, I knew who it was. Michael stood on my porch, wearing jeans and a rumpled button-down shirt instead of his expensive suits. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, looking as though he hadn't slept in days. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he looked down and said quietly, "Hi, Mom." The sorrow in his voice instantly touched my heart. I stepped aside without a word. "Come in." Michael walked in slowly, looking around the small house as if seeing it for the first time. The old sofa, the faded curtains, the pictures on the wall, and the sewing machine by the kitchen table. Nothing had changed. But Michael had. Or perhaps the issue was that he hadn't noticed how little my life had changed, while his own world grew larger and wealthier every year. "You still have this?" he asked softly, touching a wooden shelf Thomas had made decades ago. "Of course." His fingers ran over the worn surface. "I helped Dad build this when I was 12. I offered a faint smile. "You hit your thumb twice." He let out a weak laugh, and then his expression crumbled again. The silence felt heavy, filled with words neither of us knew how to say. "I made coffee," I said gently. "Would you like some?" He nodded immediately. As I poured 2 cups at the counter, I could feel him watching me quietly, trying to understand all the years he had missed. When I handed him his mug, his eyes filled with tears again. "You're still using Dad's mug." I looked down at the faded ceramic cup in my hand. "Some things just become a part of you." Michael quickly looked down. The comment clearly stung, reminding him of how many years he had spent treating important things as dispensable: people, time, family. He sat down at the kitchen table, and I returned to hemming the little pink dress. For a few minutes, the only sound in the room was the gentle hum of the sewing machine. Finally, Michael whispered, "I can't stop thinking about that night." I continued sewing quietly. "I'm glad." The honesty caught him off guard. He looked up at me. "You're angry." I paused before replying. "No," I said softly. "I feel hurt." Somehow, that was worse. Michael rubbed his face with both hands, looking exhausted. "You have every right to be angry." I was angry before. His voice cracked slightly. "Mom," I looked up at him gently, "you let people laugh at me." Tears filled his eyes again. "I know, it looked like you were ashamed to be my son." He shook his head quickly. "No." "Yes," I interrupted gently, "you were." The truth sat heavily between us. Michael stared at the table. "I don't know when I became the kind of person who could do that." I let out a soft sigh. "It happened slowly." He looked up again. "What happens?" "Forgetting the people who sacrificed for you." The words weren't delivered with anger, which only made them more painful. Michael swallowed hard. "I never forgot you, Mom." I gave him a sad smile. "No, sweetheart, you just forgot how much it cost to keep us going." Silence filled the kitchen once more. Outside, a dog barked in the distance, and the sun filtered softly through the curtains Thomas and I had chosen together. This house had seen every version of my son: the little boy, the teenager, the graduate, the successful businessman. And now, an adult man trying to look at himself with honest eyes for the first time in years. Michael's gaze drifted back to my hands. "Do you still sew every day?" "I like to stay busy." "You always say that when things are difficult." The observation surprised me. Perhaps my son noticed more than I realized, just not enough. "I should have helped you more," he whispered. "You sent money sometimes." "It wasn't enough." I remained quiet. Michael took a shaky breath. "For months, Vanessa told me that sending too much money would make you dependent." Shame flushed over his face, but I kept listening. I studied him. "Why?" He hesitated, then answered honestly. "Because without realizing it, I started to believe that success meant completely leaving struggle behind." My chest tightened. "And what does that mean?" "It means believing that people are only in difficult situations because they don't work hard enough." He looked disgusted, saying the words out loud. I can't believe I actually started to think like that. I stared at him in silence. Hearing your child repeat that kind of belief feels like mourning someone who is still alive. Michael quickly wiped his eyes. "But then I saw you standing in that ballroom." His voice broke. "And I realized the strongest person I have ever known has spent her entire life working through hardships." I finally set my sewing down. "Do you know what hurt the most?" he asked, shaking his head. "It wasn't Vanessa's laughing." Tears streamed down his face. "It was your silence." Michael completely broke down. crying the way he used to after a nightmare when he was a little boy, completely defenseless and overwhelmed. Despite everything, my first instinct was to comfort him. That is the reality of motherhood. Even a wounded heart reaches out to its child. I walked over slowly and placed a hand on his head. Michael leaned into the touch immediately, as if he had been emotionally starved for years. "I failed Dad, too," he whispered through his tears. My own eyes filled with tears. "Oh, sweetheart." He would have hated the person I became that night. I thought about Thomas for a long moment. "He would have disliked your choices," I said, gently touching Michael's cheek. "But he would never have hated you." Hearing that made Michael cry even harder, because a father's love runs deep long after they are gone. Finally, Michael looked around the small kitchen again, the old refrigerator, the worn linoleum floor, the faded curtains. He whispered something that broke my heart. "You stayed here all alone all these years." I smiled sadly. "Because of your father, this house still feels very full to me." "Yes," he said, his voice trembling, "and because of me." I looked at my son and answered with absolute honesty. "Because every sacrifice we made here built your future." Tears fell down his face again. Michael took a shaky breath, then whispered, "I don't deserve forgiveness." I thought about it carefully. "No," I replied softly, "not yet." Pain crossed his face, but before the despair could completely take over, I continued. "Forgiveness isn't just about saying the words, Michael." He looked at me silently. "It requires change." The room fell completely still. "Do you want my forgiveness?" I asked gently. "Then go and become the kind of man your father believed you were." Michael stared at me through his tears. For the first time in years, I think my son finally understood that love isn't proven through success. It's proven through character. Real change doesn't happen overnight. People like dramatic apologies because they feel satisfying, a highly emotional speech, a tearful moment, a grand gesture. But character isn't rebuilt in a single evening. It is reconstructed quietly, repeatedly, day after day. To his credit, Michael worked at it. The first sign came the following Sunday. I was watering the small roses near the porch when his black SUV pulled into my driveway again. This time, he wasn't wearing expensive loafers or a perfectly pressed shirt, just jeans, sneakers, and a nervous expression. "You don't need to drive 3 hours just to visit," I said as he walked up. "I need to," he replied simply. "No excuses, no deflecting." He spent the afternoon helping me repair the broken fence behind the house. For the first hour, we barely spoke. But unlike before, the silence didn't feel distant. It felt careful, like two people learning how to know each other again. At one point, I watched him tighten a loose board, staring at his hands. "What is it?" I asked softly. He gave a weak smile. "I forgot how exhausting manual labor is." "That's because you sit in a boardroom all day now." He lowered his head. "Dad used to do this after 12-hour shifts." The guilt still lived heavily in his heart. I could see it in everything. He noticed details now, looked at the house differently, and actually listened to me instead of checking his phone every few minutes. Awareness changes a person, even when it brings pain. Later that afternoon, as we sat on the porch drinking iced tea, Michael finally asked the question I knew had been on his mind. "Do you think Dad would be incredibly disappointed in me?" I looked out at the quiet neighborhood for a long time before answering. Thomas believed a person should be judged by what they do after they fail. Michael remained silent, so I continued. "Your father made mistakes too." He frowned slightly. "Dad." I smiled gently. "Oh, sweetheart, your father once lost almost half a month's rent because he trusted the wrong business partner." Michael blinked in surprise. "He never told me that." Because parents usually hide their worst moments from their children. He looked down at his glass thoughtfully. "What happened after that?" "He worked 2 jobs until we recovered." I smiled at the memory. "And every night he would say the exact same thing." "What?" "I will never let pride be more important than people." Michael's eyes misted over. Those words stayed with him, I could tell. Over the next few weeks, he began to visit regularly, not out of obligation, but by choice. Sometimes he brought groceries, even when I told him not to. Other times, he repaired things around the house that had been broken for years because I had put them off to save money. One Saturday, I walked into the kitchen and found him replacing the old faucet. "Did you hire a plumber?" I asked. Michael shook his head, tightening something under the sink. "No, I watched a tutorial." I let out a soft laugh. "You used to hate fixing things." "I used to hate a lot of honest things." That comment stayed with me all day. Meanwhile, things between Michael and Vanessa were clearly deteriorating. At first, he avoided talking about her, but the strain was bound to surface. One evening, while helping me organize some old photos, he suddenly said, "She thinks I'm ruining our future." I carefully set another album aside. "Because you're spending time with me." "Because I've changed." I looked at him quietly. "Have you?" He nodded slowly. "Yes." There was no pride in his answer, only honesty. That was important, too. A few days later, Michael surprised me by showing up unexpectedly on a Thursday evening. But this time, Vanessa was with him. The moment I saw her step out of the car, tension tightened in my chest. Vanessa looked incredibly uncomfortable standing in front of my small house. Even for a casual visit, she wore expensive cream-colored clothing, as if she physically couldn't exist without a polished exterior. Michael gave her a firm look before speaking. "Vanessa has something she wants to say." Vanessa glanced at him sharply, then looked at me before quickly looking away. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Finally, she let out a quiet breath. "I owe you an apology." The words sounded stiff and rehearsed, but proud people rarely offer perfect apologies. I waited silently. Vanessa crossed her arms defensively, then forced herself to continue. "What I said at the gala was cruel." "Yes," I replied gently, keeping my tone calm. "It was. And I judged you unfairly." That was also true. She swallowed. "I grew up around people who focused entirely on appearances." She lowered her eyes briefly. "I thought success meant never looking poor." There it was, not kindness, but honesty. Honestly, it was more than I expected from her. Michael watched her closely the entire time, offering no rescue, just waiting to see if she could speak truthfully. Vanessa turned back to me awkwardly. "When I saw your dress that night," she hesitated, "I assumed you didn't belong." I smiled sadly. "A lot of people thought that." Her face tightened. For the first time, I think she truly understood that cruelty remains with people long after the embarrassment fades. "I was wrong," she whispered finally. The apology wasn't overly emotional or elegant, but it was real enough. Sometimes, that is where change begins. I nodded slowly. "Thank you for saying that." A look of relief flashed across her face, but before she could mistake forgiveness for forgetting, I continued gently. "However, you cannot assume it is all right to mistreat people just because you regret it afterward." Vanessa lowered her head. "I know." "No," I corrected gently. "You are just starting to learn." The porch fell silent. Then, Michael did something that surprised us both. He reached out and held my hand openly, without hesitation or embarrassment. The son who had once stood silent while others mocked me now sat proudly by my side in plain view. That small gesture meant more than any grand speech, and Vanessa noticed it too. I think it was the first time she realized that Michael was no longer willing to build his identity on the approval of others. Later that evening, while Vanessa waited in the car, Michael helped me wash dishes in the kitchen. As he dried a plate, he asked softly, "Do you think she can change?" I thought about it before answering. People can change when losing something finally becomes more painful than protecting their pride. Michael nodded slowly. "And if they don't?" I looked at my son. "Then it's up to you to decide what kind of life you want to live." He stood quietly for a few seconds, then whispered, "It took me years to achieve success." He raised his eyes to meet mine. "But I think this is the first time in a very long time that I actually respect myself." My throat tightened. In that moment, I knew a real shift had occurred within him. It wasn't perfect, but it was genuine, and genuine change is rare. 1 year later, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror, holding that same dark blue dress, the $18 dress that had once made an entire ballroom laugh at me. The evening sun filtered through my curtains as I ran my fingers over the fabric. Over the past year, I had mended the seams twice more, added a softer lining under the sleeves, and replaced the old buttons with simple pearl ones Michael had bought for me during a visit. The dress still wasn't expensive or flashy, but somehow it didn't look small anymore, and neither did I. A quiet knock sounded at the front door. I smiled as I went to open it, already knowing who it was. Michael stood there in a dark blue suit, holding a small box of white roses. But this time there was no distance or embarrassment in his eyes, only warmth. "You look beautiful tonight, Mom," he said immediately. And this time, I believed him. I laughed softly. "You haven't even seen the whole dress yet." "I don't need to." My throat tightened with emotion. A year ago, my son had measured worth by appearances. Now, he saw the person first. That change was more important than any promotion. As we drove toward Dallas, Michael talked about his community projects and the employee scholarship program he had been expanding over the past year. 6 months ago, Charles had finally approved his promotion, not just because of his performance, but because of his growth. There is a difference, and Michael understood that now. "Charles has been pushing the mentorship program," he said as he drove. "He says leadership should protect people, not intimidate them." I smiled. Sounds like him. Michael glanced at me briefly. "He talks about you a lot." I shook my head, slightly embarrassed. "He exaggerates." "No," Michael said softly. "I think he finally met someone who showed him what success should actually look like." I quickly looked out the window to keep my tears from falling. Some compliments are still hard to carry. When we arrived at the Grand Plaza Hotel, memories rushed back so sharply I almost stopped in my tracks. The same marble entrance, the same sparkling chandeliers, the same ballroom. A year ago, I had walked into this building feeling completely invisible. Tonight felt different, not because people suddenly respected me, but because I respected myself enough not to shrink back. Michael walked to the entrance, proudly and openly letting me take his arm. There was no hesitation, a gesture that meant the world to me. As we walked into the ballroom together, the chatter quieted down, but this time, there were no mocking stares. Instead, many guests offered warm smiles, and some even came over to shake my hand. A few older women quietly thanked me for Charles's speech from the year before. Clearly, the phrase, "a person's worth is never stitched onto a price tag," had spread through the company quickly. Truth has a way of traveling fast once people are ready to listen. Near the entrance, Charles Whitmore saw us and his face lit up. "There she is," he announced warmly. Before I could react, he walked across the room and hugged me again. But this time, the embrace felt peaceful, like family reconnecting rather than history colliding. "You kept the dress," he said with a smile. "Of course." He stepped back to appreciate it. "Well," he chuckled softly, "it is officially the most famous dress in Texas now." I covered my face briefly, embarrassed. "Please don't say that." But Charles quickly grew serious. "Do you know how many letters the foundation received after last year?" I blinked in surprise. "Hundreds," he continued. "Women writing about divorce, widowhood, bankruptcy, and starting over at 60. His eyes softened. "You made people feel seen." Emotions swelled in my chest. I had spent my life thinking that just surviving was an ordinary thing. But perhaps surviving becomes powerful when your presence makes another person feel a little less alone. Music drifted through the ballroom as guests continued to arrive. Then, I noticed Vanessa standing at a table across the room. For a brief second, our eyes met. She looked different, still elegant but much quieter, with less of a sharp edge. She walked over to us slowly. I could feel Michael tense slightly beside me, not out of fear but protectiveness. Vanessa stopped a few feet away. "You look beautiful tonight, Abigail," she said softly. The sincerity surprised me. "Thank you." An awkward silence followed. Vanessa lowered her eyes briefly, then spoke again. I've been volunteering at a women's shelter twice a month now. I blinked in surprise. That's wonderful. She nodded silently. It took me a long time to realize how cruel I had become. Her honesty felt real now, no longer defensive. It was humbling. Pain often humbles people if they allow it to. Vanessa looked out at the crowd. Some of the women there remind me of the way I treated you. Her voice tightened slightly. Honestly, sometimes it makes me sick to think about it. I studied her. For the first time since meeting her, I saw vulnerability instead of a performance. It wasn't perfect, but it was human. That feeling is called growth, I said gently. Tears filled her eyes. She nodded, apologized quietly, and walked away. Michael watched her go, then looked at me. You've really forgiven her. I smiled sadly. Forgiveness and trust are two different things, Michael. He let out a quiet laugh. Yeah, he admitted. I've learned that this year too. A few minutes later, Charles took the stage, and the room fell silent. He smiled warmly in our direction before beginning his speech. 1 year ago, he said, something important happened in this ballroom. The guests listened closely. Many people came here believing that success is measured by wealth, image, status, and appearances. His gaze swept across the crowd. But one woman reminded us that dignity cannot be bought. The room was completely quiet. Tonight, Whitmore Capital is proud to officially launch a national scholarship program to support women over 55 who are rebuilding their lives after adversity. Applause broke out instantly. Then Charles smiled directly at me. And we are honored to name it the Abigail Hernandez Foundation. My breath caught. The ballroom stood and applauded once more, but this time, my tears fell for a completely different reason. It wasn't humiliation. It was healing. Michael held my hand tightly beside me. In that moment, I realized something beautiful. The greatest justice in life isn't watching cruel people fall. It's refusing to let their cruelty change who you are. I looked down one last time at my old navy dress. The garment that had once been mocked had become something else entirely. Evidence. Evidence that dignity survives humiliation. Evidence that kindness outlasts wealth. And evidence that even an $18 dress carries extraordinary grace when worn by someone who refuses to let the world harden her heart. After everything that happened, I learned an important lesson. Life will always place people in front of you who measure worth by money, appearances, status, or success. Some will view kindness as a weakness, and others will only respect those who appear powerful. But true character is revealed in quiet moments, in how we treat those who cannot benefit us, cannot impress us, and cannot elevate our image. For years, I believed that sacrifice meant keeping silent, regardless of how poorly I was treated. I thought love required me to quietly endure humiliation. But I finally understand that dignity matters just as much. You can be kind without allowing yourself to be diminished. You can forgive without forgetting your own worth. Sometimes the people we love hurt us, not because they are malicious, but because they slowly lose sight of what truly matters. Pride, ambition, and insecurity can quietly reshape a person if they stop protecting their own heart. What matters most is whether they are willing to change when the truth finally reaches them. Michael changed because he chose humility over ego. Vanessa changed because shame forced her to look at herself honestly. And I changed because I stopped apologizing for surviving. If you are going through a financial, emotional, or personal struggle today, remember this. Your worth is never determined by a price tag on your clothes, your home, your career, or your bank account. Dignity comes from how you love, how you sacrifice, how you endure, and how you continue to show kindness in a world that often forgets how much it matters.